Welcome to the section about diversity and oppression part of the training. We're going to start right off with this with a video of a discussion panel that happened, I think, concurrently with the Democratic National Convention prior to the 2016 presidential election. So the video is pretty long. It's almost an hour and a half. There's a link below this video that you can click on to watch it. So go ahead and pause this one and then click and watch that one. Okay, so I hope that you found that video and the women on that panel interesting and educational. I really enjoy watching it. So normally we would have a group discussion if we were doing this in person, but instead you can just kind of look at some of these questions and think about your answers to them. How did the comments in this video impact your understanding? Name something that you hadn't ever thought about before, maybe, or thought about very much. How is that going to change your understanding to help you in the work here at Project Hope? And how can we better understand the perpetuation of the problems we're trying to solve, and understand how these issues make things worse for survivors, and how to meet survivors with where they're coming from, what they've been walking through in their life already prior to having been victimized. So just kind of think about some of those things. These might be on the quiz. I can't remember. But even if they're not, then I invite you to think about them for yourself. And so then we're going to take some of the things talked about in this video, some of the concepts of oppression and diversity and inclusion, and talk about them a little further. So diversity and inclusion are two different things. Diversity, there's a quote that says, "Diversity is being invited to the party, and inclusion is being asked to dance." So that's sort of a two-step process. Diversity is the who and the what. So who's sitting around the table, who's being recruited to work at a particular company, who's being promoted, who are we tracking as far as their characteristics of gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc. Those inherent sort of diversity characteristics that we're all born with. And then generally when we're looking for this, we're targeting those outside the presumed center of, white, straight men, essentially. And so we're just looking for, who's represented at a company or whatever. And it's pretty easy to measure diversity because it's just a numbers game. It's how many people of color do we have? How many women do we have? How many people from the LGBTQ population do we have? That kind of thing. It's basically a head count, so it's pretty easy to get a handle on the diversity of a particular company or organization. Inclusion is a little bit more difficult. So this is the how. This is behaviors that welcome and embrace diversity. So quantifying how inclusive somewhere is can be really difficult. So there's being hired, and that's sort of satisfying diversity. But then there's knowing that you're never going to be part of management. So that's not fully being inclusive of people who are outside that center. because it doesn't really matter if you get hired if you know you're not going to have the same opportunities as other people. And so even if we have diversity, even if we, admit students to colleges that are diverse, or we hire people that are diverse, if they're not really being included in all of the same opportunities, then there's not really going to be any real change. So this is much more about so we're going to talk about the anti-oppression framework, which is a framework that seeks to recognize societal oppression and mitigate its effects to equalize the power balance in our communities. And it challenged that existing center. Again, often in our societies, the center is straight white men, and it questions who designed that center, and if it's the best structure and what its implications are, and just generally sort of asking, like, why is this the way that this is? Anti-oppression framework may not include everyone. It focuses on addressing and undoing oppressive structures and empowering oppressed identity groups. There's an emphasis on systemic and structural change, but it understands that individuals are connected to and participating in the system. So it recognizes both the systemic as well as the individuals that make up that system. And it confronts individual and societal examples of oppression. By confronting our own roles of power and oppression in our communities, we have to realize the power we hold so we don't contribute to a larger system of oppression. It also takes into account the historical legacy of the root causes of where these oppressions come from, and tries to tear them down and rebuild them. So we're going to talk about the 4 I's of oppression, not impression. The first one is ideological. So this is a system of beliefs or ideas that are dominant narratives that work to those other groups, so making people outside of that center be a group of others. Oppressive systems have at their core the idea that one group is somehow better than another and in some measure has the right to control the other group. So this idea gets elaborated in many different ways. A group may think that they are more intelligent, harder workers, stronger, more capable, more noble, more deserving, more advanced, are chosen, or superior, and etc. This could go on and on. The dominant group holds this idea about itself, and therefore, of course, the opposite qualities are attributed to the other group or groups. So those people are viewed as stupid or lazy, weak, incompetent, worthless, less deserving, backward, inferior, and so on. So then that's sort of the highest level in the ideological level of things. The next one down is institutional. And so this is how institutions and systems reinforce those ideologies that we talked about. When we say institutions, we mean things like media, the medical system, the legal, education systems, religion, psychiatry, financial systems, etc. So the idea that one group is better than another and has the right to control the other gets embedded inside these institutions of our society, in the laws, the legal system, police practices, policy, education system, hiring practices, housing, media images, political power, etc. It's embedded in everything. So when a woman makes 2/3 of what a man makes, that's institutionalized sexism. And when we have 1 out of 4 African American men are in jail or on probation, that's institutionalized racism. So consider that also the dominant culture controls the language that is used to describe all groups in society and can make things visible or invisible when necessary. Other examples and things to consider are things like the war on drugs instead of the war on poverty, or an expanded definition of violence and how violence towards targeted groups happens at a systemic level. The next level down is the interpersonal oppression. So this is the idea that one group is better than another and has the right to control the other. They get structured into our institutions, gives permission and reinforcement for individual members of the dominant group to personally mistreat individuals in the targeted or oppressed group. Interpersonal racism is what white people do to people of color close up. So that's racist jokes, reinforcing stereotypes, beating and harassing people of color, making threats, and a whole host of other personal acts of discrimination. Similarly, interpersonal sexism is what one gender does to the other. So sexual abuse or harassment, violence directed at the opposite gender, which is usually women are on the receiving end of that. Sexist jokes, ignoring or minimizing the other gender's thinking and concerns, etc. Many people in the dominant group, whatever it may be, are not consciously oppressive. They have just internalized the negative messages about other groups and consider their attitudes towards other groups as normal. And then the fourth I of oppression is internalized. So this is when oppression works within the group of people who suffer the most from the mistreatment. Oppressed people internalize the ideology of inferiority, and they see it reflected in the institutions they're part of, and they experience mistreatment interpersonally from members of the dominant group. And through all of this, they eventually come to internalize the negative messages about themselves. And when this happens, the oppressors no longer need to exert any, heavy amounts of dominance because the oppressed group now does it to themselves and each other. So that's going all through all of the sort of levels of oppression. So then the question often comes up if reverse isms exist. So this is when people claim that people of color can be racist towards white people. And while people of color can certainly discriminate against or have prejudices against and anger towards white people as a group or individual white people, and they may act these feelings out in destructive and harmful ways, these acts will most often be severely punished. The backlash of the full force of law enforcement and courts, or even just a gang of sort of vigilante justice type white people who are trying to get even, are likely to come back on those people of color who have acted out their anger, because the individual prejudices that people of color may have are not backed up by the institutional racism piece of it. They don't have the backing of the legal system and all of the dominant white institutions that we have. So the oppressed group, therefore, doesn't have the power to enforce its prejudice, unlike the dominant group. So, for example, the racist beating of Rodney King by the police in LA in the 90s was upheld by the court system, which would probably have not ever happened if Rodney King had been white and the officers had been black. So, again, just to reinforce, members of an oppressed group can certainly have prejudice and discrimination towards members of the dominant group, and they can act those out. However, they don't have the backing of all of the systems behind them to be able to make it racism on that systemic level. And another way to look at it is to think of men's rights activist groups who feel that feminism is a movement designed to oppress men. And again, because women are generally the oppressed group, they don't have the full backing of all the systems in place to make that a sexist thing. So essentially the answer is no. There are not reverse isms because those individual prejudices aren't able to carry the full weight of like an institutionalized and an ideological racism or sexism behind it. So oppression is a process. Um, it always begins from the outside of the oppressed group by the dominant group, but eventually it becomes internalized, and the external oppression hardly needs to be felt for the damage to be done. If people from the oppressed group feel bad about themselves and because of the nature of the system do not have the power to direct those feelings back towards the dominant group without receiving that blowback that we talked about, then there are only two places for these feelings to go, which is on yourself and on the people in your same group, which is known as horizontal violence, when you sort of attack to your peers. So therefore, people in any targeted group have to really struggle to keep from feeling heavy feelings of powerlessness and despair. And on the way to eliminating institutional oppression, each group that's oppressed has to undo the internalized beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors that stem from the oppression so that they can build unity and power among people in that group, support its leaders, and feel proud of its contradictions, and develop strength and organize. So we have another video here coming up. It's not very long, I think it's about 4 minutes. So you can pause this video and then click on the link below for the privilege video. And I invite you, after watching the video, to expand the comments underneath that video to look at all of the questions that are asked throughout. They don't really show all of them in the video, but if you expand that description box, you can see the whole list of questions that they ask in the video, and I invite you to check it out just to get more of a picture of what they use to determine privilege in this video. So go ahead and pause this one and click on that one. Okay, so I hope that I enjoy watching that video. I think that it's really illuminating and can help us understand, what kinds of things that people are born into, they don't really have control over, what kinds of things can really impact how privileged or not their lives may be. So it's important to note that oppression, similar to how we've talked about how like risk factors and things in the ecological model don't exist in a vacuum, that there's factors at the societal, community, relationship, and individual level. The same goes for oppression. None of those 4 eyes of oppression exist separately. They're all interconnected and supported by each other, and they all are intertwined to form a system of oppression. It's important to note that any attempt to dismantle oppression, to dismantle oppression should include an element of challenge at all 4 levels in order to have any hope at resulting in change. I'd also like to take a minute to note some vocabulary that's used. Oftentimes, these oppressed groups are labeled things like marginalized or minorities, underserved, subjugated, all terms that are sort of passive terms. It sort of indicates that that's just sort of their identity, is that they are disenfranchised or underserved. So we prefer to use the term targeted populations because that's a much more active way of talking about them and approaching the issue. Because it's a much more it's a strong verb to show that this isn't just something that's there, that's happened, that is just the way that it is. It indicates that these groups are actively targeted by our systems and people and communities to oppress them and make them less than the dominant group. Um, so being conscious of that word choice is a really important first step to take in having the correct approach to try and correct these issues. And then the last thing is just thinking about everything that we've talked about and think for yourself, how can we use, hopefully you have new understandings of oppression and specifically internalized oppression to think about and understand the impacts of power and dominance inside relationships. And if you think of abusive behaviors and oppressive behaviors, to just give you a new insight into how victims are affected by these behaviors. So just really thinking about how these different forms of oppression can tie into the work that we do here at Project Hope, and how they go from sort of that high level institutional and ideological standpoint, and how that works in an actual interpersonal relationship, and how that can shape the way a survivor might deal with something or how they might perceive their situation, and just things like that. So that is the end of the society section of the training. If you had questions or comments that came up throughout the training, I hope that you made note of them somewhere and then can talk about them here in the office in person. Please remember to do the quiz that's associated with this training section, and I hope that you are better informed about oppression in our society.